Hello, friends, and welcome back to Ghouls Night In, the spooky chat show with your best ghoul friends. I'm Penny Snark.
And I'm Midge Munster. And Penny, welcome back to Midge's Monster Menagerie.
Mm,
Uh,
I do love
we
a visit to the menagerie.
the Menagerie of Monsters. We've talked a lot, many different times in many different ways about how the cold months are scary and how
Mm-hmm.
we just talked in our last episode about how the
We
cold is
sure
scary.
did.
And we've talked a lot about different ways that people throughout history have coped with that, from telling ghost stories at Christmas and making creatures like Krampus. The horrors of a long, cold winter have been personified a lot of different ways by a lot of different cultures. But there's one thing I've been wanting to talk about for a while, a creature that is associated with winter, that I think is one of the scariest boys out there. So today we're going to talk about the wendigo.
Ooh.
Woo.
Ooh.
My first introduction to the wendigo was actually through a video game. uh, if any of you have played the game Until Dawn, still to this day one of my favorite video games I've ever played.
Mine was from the TV program Supernatural, so
Yes,
we're
yes, it
on the
does.
same path.
Does make an appearance in Supernatural, absolutely. Um, and actually, Until Dawn is getting made into a film. I think April this year. I'm very
Mm.
hyped about that. But the true origins of this folklore come from Algonquian language tribes of North America, and specifically the tribes that are indigenous to what is now Canada, parts of Alberta, all the way over to Quebec, and then down into the Great Lakes areas of the United States. And the specific tribes that share stories of the Wendigo include the Ojibwe, Cree, Naskapi, and Innu people, which is different than Inuit people.
Mhm.
I want to make that distinction.
Yeah.
The Innu are an indigenous native tribe to uh, more towards the U.S.
Okay.
Not an Arctic culture.
No, we have moved away. We're going a
We've
little bit south. We're still
Yeah,
pretty north, but a little bit
because
more south.
because we specifically talked about the Inuit people
Yes.
last episode. On one, let's make that distinction. But the stories of these people have been kept alive for hundreds of years through oral tradition, obviously, with the first written accounts not appearing until 1636. So very, very old tradition. That's
Mhm.
the first time we see it written down, and that's by a French Jesuit missionary. um,
Sounds like a Jesuit.
right.
They do love to write stuff down.
They were everywhere writing down everything
Mhm,
at that
mhm.
point. A lot of our documentation comes from the Jesuit missionaries. But before that, rich history of oral tradition and many different interpretations of this cryptid creature. So, what is the Wendigo? Uh, both because of different groups having different ways of viewing this creature, and also because, as things do, it's changed over time with modern stories and media interpretations. The physical depiction of this has been viewed different ways.
Mhm.
The classic interpretation, though, is a very emaciated, corpse like creature with thin gray skin pulled tight over a humanoid skeletal frame. And they're usually said to have either lots of sharp teeth or kind of fang like teeth, claws, and glowing red eyes.
Mhm.
Honestly, it was kind of funny reading a lot of this and like looking at early illustrations. He'd be looking a lot like Nosferatu, honestly.
Mhm.
Like, it's like I'm seeing maybe where some of this early vampire lore got.
Right. I was say
uh
people do when people imagine a creature, the scariest creature they can think of, a lot of the times similar features.
Similar things, yeah, absolutely. Some legends of the Innu people describe it as being a giant ice creature, which is very
Mm.
cool, like an ice skeleton with a heart of ice. Others say that it is so thin that you can only see it from the front, because when it
Ooh.
turns sideways, it disappears. Skinny.
Skinny legend.
Quite literally, skinny legend. um, but regardless of how it appears, very creepy to see in the cold woods. The word wendigo can be translated to spirit of the lonely places, which I think is
Mm.
very
Very
spooky.
poetic, yeah.
Hmm. Or in some regions closer to Minnesota, it also is windwalker,
Mm.
which, quick note here as well, because I think this comes up from time to time. A wendigo and a skinwalker are not the same thing.
Mhm.
They have a lot of similarities, but not the same thing. And we will do an episode on skinwalkers eventually as well, because that's some lore that I really really enjoy. Um, but wendigo in traditional folklore is as much a spirit as it is a beast,
Mhm.
and it's said to possess people, but not just anybody. It's very careful how it chooses its victims.
Not just anybody.
Not just anyone. So, for the context of this creature, it's important to think about where these tribes were indigenous to, where they're living. These are extremely harsh climates. We're talking
Mhm.
the woods of like Canada, what is now Canada. That I mean, we literally talked about this in our last episode.
Yep.
Just very intense winters. Um, there is a lot of history, both like what we talked about last time, but with indigenous people as well, of like people having to resort to a lot of things to survive these long, harsh winters, and not
Mhm.
having as many opportunities to hunt, etc. Um, so the Wendigo legend kind of comes about as a way to warn people against the temptations that arise during these harsh
Mhm.
winters. First, of course, it's important for people to not be selfish or be gluttonous, because they are having to ration food to make it through. They're also specifically dealing with surviving in groups. The Wendigo is known to attack people who are in the lonely places, as it
Mhm.
describes. So, not wandering too far into the woods by yourself, not wandering off from the group. Uh, and above all, not resorting to cannibalism
No,
when
no,
things
no.
inevitably get very
Yep.
challenging. Uh, so, the spirit of the Wendigo is said to possess anybody who succumbs to any of these temptations. And it's a representation of greed, excess, moral corruption. It deals with very real life horrors of the
Mhm.
winter, including isolation and starvation, things that were very prevalent to people in this time period. I mean, these things happen to people now, but it
Yeah,
was much more intense in the times that this
totally.
was developing.
Lots of fewer resources or options.
Right. Yeah. If you're stuck, you're stuck.
Mhm.
Nobody's coming to help you.
Nope.
Um, so once one becomes possessed by the spirit of the Wendigo, they transform into the beast. They become insatiable. They have this uncurable hunger. They're constantly starving, and they're always craving more human flesh. And one other thing that across all accounts in history, everybody can agree that this sucker is huge. He's tall. Usually there's a lot of discrepancy, but it's like anywhere from 15 to 40 feet tall,
Oh, geez. That's
big
real
boy.
tall.
And a lot of the legends say that they continue to grow with each meal they
Oh,
eat,
sure.
and that they basically gain the size of the person that they eat. So you could see over many years how they would get quite tall.
Indeed.
Now, if you're like me and you've seen this little sucker around in places that are not indigenous lore,
Yes.
you might be familiar-ish with it and be thinking, Midge, now isn't this that cryptid with fur and antlers that has like a stag skull for a head? And the answer is, in some ways, yes, but also more really no.
But mostly, no.
But mostly, definitely not. So the Wendigo never had antlers or a
Mhm.
stag head in indigenous people's legends. The closest thing to a modern idea of the Wendigo is a creature called the Wachuge, and that appears in a completely different
Yeah.
subsect of indigenous people, the Athabascan people, and it is like a deer monster.
Mhm.
But there there's some similarities in the sense that it's kind of a man hunting creature, but the lore of it and how it becomes what it is not related at all.
Yeah.
So, why do we associate antlers with Wendigo?
True, we do.
We sure do. Well, one of the first times we see the Wendigo in literature, in Western literature, is Algernon Blackwood, 1910, writes a novella called The Wendigo. Now,
Hey.
now, if you're an avid listener of the pod, that name might sound familiar because in 2023, when we did our Victorian Ghost Story Christmas special, the story The Kit Bag is written by Algernon Blackwood.
And also just
Same,
one of the top goth names.
one of the best pen names I've ever. Yeah, I don't. I mean, I guess that I don't know if that was his real name or if that was his like nom de plume, but
I don't know.
regardless,
Either way, goth as hell. I appreciate it.
an absolute slay. Yeah. Um. So same fella, but in this novella that he writes in 1910, he writes a story about a hunting expedition.
Mhm.
Surprise, of white people with one indigenous person with them as a guide. That go
As you
into
do.
yeah, classic Lewis and Clark situation.
Classic white people.
And they go into the Canadian wilderness in the winter to hunt, and they get terrorized by this unseen force of nature the whole time. So, because it is unseen in the book, obviously, Blackwood's Wendigo is not responsible for
Mhm.
our antlered boy, but this piece of literature becomes really important for how the Wendigo is absorbed into the kind of larger consciousness of future horror writers,
Mhm.
including Alvin Schwartz, who is the author of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There is
Ooh.
a Wendigo tale in that, which is very heavily influenced by Blackwood's novella because again that's kind of an unseen thing in that story that
Mhm.
stalks you and like picks you up and drops you. We don't see him there either.
Yeah, I know that I must have read that, but I
Yeah,
obviously did not, like, click it in my brain to be like, "Ah, this is this creature."
yeah, and I kind of wish that it had been because I'm thinking, man, the illustration of a real Wendigo by that artist would have been insane.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, we don't see him there, and then later, of course, or well, no, before I guess, um, Stephen King uh,
Oh.
places the Wendigo at the center of Pet Cemetery in the
Yes.
book. The Wendigo does not appear in the film adaptation, probably for obvious reasons, uh, but he that is featured pretty prevalently in the novel, and I believe I have not seen the newer adaptations of Pet Cemetery, but I do believe that they reinstate that plot line
Hmm,
in like Pet Cemetery bloodlines and stuff like that.
okay, yeah, I have not seen those either, so I
Yeah,
cannot speak to it.
but not in the OG film, but is in the book. Uh, but again, still no antlers. So
No.
we're,
Where's
we're
the antlers?
"Ooh, show me the antlers. So
I'm just thinking of what, oh, Wheel of Fortune? Is that Wheel of Fortune? Show me antlers!
yeah, exactly. Um, but mostly the 2001 film Wendigo has been attributed to the moment when the beast gains its antlers. So the filmmaker for this film, Larry Fessenden, claimed that a teacher in school had originally told him a what he called a Wendigo-like story
Hmm.
um, with a deer monster, and he combined that in his head with the tale from Scary Stories and the story of Algernon Blackwood, and created his own mythology around the beast that he used for his film. And that imagery has definitely stuck. Even in like extremely current media, I'm about to get into some exciting stuff for both of us, Penny. This symbolism in shows like Hannibal
Yeah,
and
I was gonna
Yellow
say, I think it's
Jackets.
Hannibal, yep.
Yeah, and Yellow Jackets, we see like stags and humanoid shapes with antlers being interlaced with themes of cannibalism. This has
Yeah.
become very like standardized, um, which is really interesting because
That's
the
crazy that it
Algonquin.
was, like, 2001.
Right, right, like
What?
just now, basically. Yeah. From a story that's hundreds and hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
Um, and the Algonquin language people, like, they had great respect for deer and stags,
Yeah.
and that imagery was most frequently associated with positive nature spirits. So it would have been extremely unlikely and strange for them to use that imagery for an
Yeah.
evil entity. So it's most likely that one of two things happened here. A, uh, people mixed up this legend with the Wachuge, the deer
Mhm.
creature. Uh, but unfortunately, it's probably more likely that B, a stereotype of indigenous people informed this choice. It
Yeah.
it was not uncommon for native people to wear headpieces made of antlers or
Mhm.
skulls for rituals, and so that imagery of a native person, which of course Westerners and like what colonizers associate with
Yeah.
like them being savages, uh,
Mhm.
that idea of a indigenous person turning into a beast would get interlaced with this idea of wearing the antlers on their head. So, as I mentioned in the last episode, surprise, it's colonialism.
Surprise. I'm like, I was gonna say, actually, it's never a surprise because
It's yeah, it's not.
it's
It's
always
always
ugh,
colonialism.
boo.
So that's a bummer. But returning to the top of the episode, one thing I did think is cool, Until Dawn, the game that I mentioned, they were really intentional about using the classic, like
Mhm.
traditional depiction of the Wendigo, and I think that's really cool. Because arguably the like silhouette of a big scary creature with like a skull head is like cooler for a game
Yeah.
design, but they were really intentional about sticking to the classic like lore of the creature. And I promise you, it is equally as scary without the others.
Just as
they
scary.
they did not miss out on anything there. Uh, so that's the legend. But despite it being the stuff of stories, there are historical accounts of people committing crimes and saying that they were under the possession of a Wendigo.
Mm.
And of course, it's wintertime. It's wintertime in the Victorian times.
Right.
And in the winter of 1878, a Cree man named Swift Runner killed and ate his family of 7.
Oof.
Yes, claiming that he was under the possession of a Wendigo. And he kind of becomes the face of a what gets dubbed Wendigo psychosis,
Mhm.
um, which is technically classified as a psychological condition. This is like hotly debated.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
which part of that, of course, again, is because it is extremely cultural and it affects people who are it mostly affects people who are familiar with the legend, who
Yeah.
are indigenous people. Um, so, possible that it's dismissed because of that. Um, but also, there are a lot of other factors at play when you're dealing with people who, again, are going through extremely harsh conditions, who are isolated. The interesting thing with Swift Runner is that he had some issues, and he had been kind of thrown out. He had like good relationships with a lot of the like law and stuff. Like he was a trapper and a guide,
Hmm.
and so he had like good relationships with the non-indigenous folk. And then he caused some trouble, kind of got cast out there, and then he also got cast out by his tribe. And so he set up camp with his family during the winter, which is when these events occurred. But according to historians, like he had access to other resources.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't like necessarily a survival tactic
Yeah.
to eat 7 people. So again, there's a layer here of being cast out, being like isolated from society in a mental way.
Yeah.
That definitely, I think, contributed to what happened here. He also loses a child before this happens, because they do find one of his sons buried and not cannibalized.
Hmm.
And so it's also possible that that had a strong impact on his
Yeah.
mental state, losing a child, and then losing a child to the harsh conditions, which were kind of put on them by the fact that his actions got them cast out. So this is a nuanced, layered
Yeah.
situation.
It's a complicated situation.
But Wendigo psychosis does become a real thing for a while that people actually diagnose people with. Um, and there was unfortunately also a Cree chief and shaman who was named Jack Fiddler, who was kind of believed to, because he was the shaman, he was in charge of like casting out bad things and
Yeah.
evil. And because of that, he got away with killing like 14 people in his
Whoop.
tribe who were, quote, afflicted with wendigo psychosis.
Hmm.
Um, so, not good things
Not
all
great.
around. Um, and, it's, I don't know, I always find this interesting where like legend and lore kind of lead to like real life horrors that
Yeah.
occur. And unfortunately, anywhere there's a scapegoat or a scape cryptid, as it were, people will take advantage of that.
Definitely.
But this, for the most part, is a really cool, a really cool creature, a very important part of Algonquin folklore. And I mean, it is easy to me to see why others have been inclined to adapt it into modern horror scenarios. It plays on a lot of universal fears.
Sure.
Um, and I mean, who, that was going to sound horrible. I'm like, who doesn't love a good cannibalism story? There's a reason why shows like Hannibal and Yellow Jackets have gained the popularity that they have. There is
Yeah,
something
it's true.
very like nothing really more horrific than the idea of a human having to resort to that.
Yeah, we're always going to be fascinated by the strongest taboos.
Exactly. But that is the abridged history of the Wendigo. Thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed learning about a new creature, and please always let us know if there are cryptids or legends in your own personal folklore from around the world that you would like to hear us delve into on the pod. We really like learning about this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
If you enjoyed today's episode, you can always leave us a rating or a review wherever you listen. If you can't leave us a review on your podcatcher of choice, you can always send those to us in an Instagram DM, or Spotify does allow comments now as well. But I believe Penny has an Apple review to share with us today.
I sure do. This review is from Beanie B and is titled Spooky Ghoul Friends. And Beanie writes, I stumbled upon Midge's YouTube late last summer while looking for early Halloween content, which led me here, and I immediately knew I was in the right place. I love all things gently spooky, and Ghouls Night In perfectly encapsulates that vibe. Penny and Midge are smart, sassy, and unabashedly themselves, and their thoughtful approach and charming chemistry make the strange and unusual feel accessible and fun. 10 stars, 5 for each of you. And we've got
Yay!
a coffin, a crystal ball, a spider web, a jack-o'-lantern, and a magic wand. Hell
Nice.
yeah.
I love when we each get 5 stars.
You gotta. You guys don't know. Once we turn off the recording, we fight bitterly about the 5 stars if we don't each get our own.
We need to start doing like an untucked. It's like the after the mic.
Yes. Oh my god.
Just us throwing hands about
Yep.
who gets what stars.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for that review, and thank you all for continuing to listen and support our little podcast. We love making it for you. If you are looking for more from us, you can check us out on Instagram at Ghouls Night In Pod. And if you're looking for me, you can find me all over the web at Midge Munster.
And you can find me at Penny Snark.
And until next time,
Goodbye.
bye.